Hi everyone. The composer that I picked to talk about this week is Sergei Rachmaninoff, who is a Russian composer, another Russian, born in 1873 and died in 1943. So he's a later generation coming after Tchaikovsky and Rimsky-Korsakov, who we talked about in previous weeks, and he knew their music and was influenced by it. And like them, he is a romantic composer. So since I've used that word several times, I thought I should probably just go over a little bit what the Romantic period is, what music from the Romantic period kind of sounds like. So the Romantic period begins with Beethoven in the 1820s or so, and goes up until the beginning of the 20th century. And it was really a reaction against the classical period, which came before the Romantic period. So the classical period was all about the principles of the Age of Enlightenment. So ideas like reason, that human reason could understand and figure out and create anything, and order and balance. So classical music is, if I use the term formulaic, that makes it sound like it's boring or it's not creative. It's creative in its own way, but within kind of rules and forms and things like that. So you'll have, chord progressions that kind of, where the chords kind of go in a specific order. Forms where the different sections of a piece kind of follow a pattern. Melodies that are very symmetrical, like the melody will consist of maybe like a 4-measure kind of question and a 4-measure answer, that sort of thing. And so the Romantic period is a reaction against that. It's a much greater emphasis on expression and feeling and individualism. So the composers of the Romantic period did not completely reject everything that came before them. They're still, using harmonies. They're still using certain forms to structure their pieces, but it's like everything just gets bigger and more intense. Have bigger orchestras with more instruments and a greater variety of instruments. You have melodies, but they're longer and more expressive. You have longer harmonic progressions that the chords don't always necessarily go in quite the same order as they did in the classical period. The composers kind of break the rules, so to speak, more often with their the order that the chords come in. Things like that. So it's kind of like, and the forms, everything's longer and bigger. Like a classical symphony, it would not be unusual for a classical symphony to be maybe a half-hour long, and it would not be unusual for a romantic symphony to be an hour long. So it's just like the expression and the emotion is so huge that it can't be contained the way that it could in the classical era. So Rachmaninoff, being born in the 1870s, definitely was born right there in kind of the heart of the Romantic period, or toward the tail end of it, and he wrote in that style. But throughout his career, his style did not change. So even though he was alive until the 1940s, and there was a lot of very modern music being written in the last few decades of his life, he really didn't change his compositional style to match that more modern style. He continued to write in a very romantic style. And I think it's important to note too, part of the reason for that is he didn't compose a lot in the latter part of his life. In 1917, the Russian Revolution happened that we hear about in the Timeline song, Lenin and the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And shortly after that, he left Russia and pretty quickly came to America and didn't really compose a lot after that. And the reason for that is, and an important factor in his composition, is that he was an incredibly talented pianist. And once he came to the U.S., in order to make money, he did a lot more performing as opposed to composing. So the majority of his compositions were written in the first few decades of his life before he left Russia. And because he was a great pianist, the majority of his compositions, certainly his best known compositions today, are for piano. Either piano alone or piano accompanied by orchestra. So I picked an example of each to listen to this week. One is piano alone, and it's called Prelude in C sharp minor. And by this point in time, he wrote it in the 1890s. It was one of his first pieces after finishing music school, conservatory. By this point in time, the word prelude basically just means a short piece. It kind of implies, the name prelude kind of implies that something comes after it. It's a prelude to something else. And in earlier periods of music composition, like the Baroque period, that would be correct. A prelude would be like an introduction to a larger piece. But by this point, it has kind of lost that meaning, and it's just a short piece. So Rachmaninoff wrote actually a prelude in every key, all 24 major and minor keys, and this is just probably the best known one. They weren't necessarily written as a set. Just during the course of his career, he wrote that many different preludes, and I'd say this is the best known piece. And in this one, I would suggest just listening for I was really struck when I listened to it for the first time in a long time by all the dynamic changes. So when we study the tin whistle, we'll study different dynamics, which is the volume that the music, how loud or soft the music is. We'll study the names of different dynamics, but for this piece, if you just listen to how the dynamics change, in a lot of cases it's really gradual. So you'll go from a soft dynamic very, very slowly to a much louder dynamic, and that is called a crescendo, when the music goes from soft to loud. And I believe crescendo just literally means growing, so it's where the volume is growing from quieter to louder. And then the opposite of that is decrescendo, so that's where the volume is going from louder back to softer. So I think if you listen to that, there are some really nice gradual crescendos and decrescendos that I think are part of what gives this piece its structure. And then the other piece that I chose is probably his best known piece, and it's really one of probably the best known and best loved classical pieces in the entire classical musical repertoire, and it's his Piano Concerto No. 2. He wrote 4 piano concertos, and a concerto is basically just a piece for one or more solo instruments, in this case the piano, accompanied by some other group, or some other accompaniment, in this case the full orchestra. Concerto is a very common genre in classical music, so lots of piano concertos, a lot of violin concertos, a decent number of cello concertos. Other instruments, there are some concertos, but those are kind of the big 3 that composers have historically written concertos for. And it's 3 movements. That's very standard for a concerto. But it's basically just a showpiece for a performer to show off his or her technique and musicianship as a soloist. Let's see. This, like I said, it's 3 movements. And I was also going to say it's kind of also sort of like a dialogue between the solo instrument and the accompaniment. So that's one thing you can listen for in this piece. And I'll mark or put the times where each movement begins in case you want to kind of get a little taste of each movement without listening to the whole thing. But that's a good thing to listen to, is kind of how the piano interacts with the orchestra. When they're playing together, when the piano only is playing, when the orchestra only is playing, and when they're kind of almost talking back and forth with each other. Around minute 30, I think it is, between minute 30 and 30 minutes and 30 seconds, there's a great little passage where you can see the pianist's hands, so you can see how he's kind of almost talking on the instrument back and forth with the orchestra. So that's something that happens in concertos, or that's interesting to listen to, is how the solo instrument interacts with the orchestra. Yeah, this is one of his best known pieces. He wrote these piano pieces for himself to perform, but they are very widely performed today. He's probably one of the more popular piano composers today. For very skilled pianists to play, his works are very technically challenging. Um, and I also, just kind of as a bonus, I included a piece that's new to me that I just discovered as I was doing a little bit of research for this video, and it's called his All Night Vigil, and it's just beautiful, beautiful choral music, unaccompanied voices. So it's liturgical music for the Eastern Orthodox Church, written while he was still in Russia. And it's just so beautiful. I've never heard it before, and I think it's really nice if you like to listen to music while you do some of your other schoolwork. It's just really calm and beautiful music. One thing you could listen for in this is listen to how low the bass voices, the very lowest men's voices, sing. That is a really characteristic feature of Russian music. I don't know how that tradition began, but super, super low at times in the bass voices. It's very unique to Russian music. But that's just a bonus if you like his music. I think it's very beautiful music to listen to. Rachmaninoff is not necessarily the most historically influential composer, the way that some of the other composers we'll look at are, but still very beloved music just because it's so beautiful, beautiful melodies, and just so enjoyable to listen to. So he is a very popular composer today, and I thought he's worth listening to just because it's so nice to listen to. So that is Sergei Rachmaninoff, a romantic Russian composer, kind of straddling the end of the 1800s into the 1900s.